Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from. Today we're covering a thread of this war that's been quietly running in the background of almost everything else we've discussed. Thousands of Kurdish fighters, organized across multiple parties and factions, actively engaging Iranian forces in a sustained, ongoing conflict across western Iran. This isn't some minor border skirmish. It's a genuine, sustained insurgency that's been building since the very first days of this war. And I think once you see the full arc of it, you'll understand why Iran has treated it as one of its most serious internal security threats throughout this entire conflict. So let's walk through the whole story. Let's start with who we're actually talking about, because the Kurdish population in Iran is genuinely significant, making up somewhere around 10 to 12% of the entire country's population, concentrated along the western border region that's been known as Iranian Kurdistan for centuries. This isn't a small fringe ethnic minority. It's a substantial population with its own distinct language and culture, and critically, a long, well-documented history of armed resistance against the Islamic Republic specifically, stretching back decades before this current war ever began. That history genuinely matters for understanding what's happening right now. Back in 1979, when the Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah, Kurds in western Iran saw a real opportunity to finally secure the autonomy that had been denied them under the previous monarchy. The Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, led by Abdul Rahman Ghasemlu, along with the leftist Kamala Party, mobilized Peshmerga fighters and actually seized control of much of Iranian Kurdistan at the time. The newly formed Islamic Republic under Khomeini refused to negotiate any kind of Kurdish autonomy and declared outright jihad against the Kurdish movement that same year. The resulting rebellion was genuinely brutal. Roughly 10,000 people killed, including 1,200 Kurdish political prisoners executed by the government. That's the foundational trauma underlying this entire relationship, and it's shaped every subsequent chapter of Kurdish resistance in Iran since, including a genuinely dark assassination campaign throughout the 80s and 90s that saw KDPI's own leader, Ghasemlu, assassinated in Vienna during actual peace negotiations in 1989, followed by another mass assassination of senior KDPI officials in Berlin in 1992. The insurgency has flared up repeatedly in the decades since, PJAK launching a fresh insurgency from the Kandil Mountains back in 2004, a major Iranian military offensive against them in 2011, and Iran firing 7 ballistic missiles directly at KDPI headquarters in Iraq back in 2018, killing at least 18 people. So when this current war broke out on February 28, 2026, Kurdish opposition groups didn't just spontaneously decide to get involved. They were stepping into a role they'd been organizing and preparing for over an extended period, amid what had already been growing political instability inside Iran throughout late 2025 and early 2026. Major Iranian Kurdish parties had already called for general strikes during the broader Iranian protest movement. Strikes that were largely observed by the Kurdish population, and they'd already begun carrying out limited insurgent operations while formally uniting under a new umbrella organization called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan. On the very first day of this war, representatives of that Kurdish coalition stated publicly that they were jointly coordinating political and military decisions and preparing for what they called a new phase, claiming their forces were already positioned deep inside Iranian territory and along the Iran-Iraq border, ready to respond as the broader war situation developed. That's a genuinely significant, immediate mobilization happening within hours of the war's opening strikes. Iran's own response to this Kurdish mobilization was swift and severe from the very beginning. On March 2nd, the Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PAK, announced that 2 of its bases in Erbil had been directly targeted, with strikes killing at least 1 PAK fighter. Just 4 days later, on March 6th, Iran issued a direct, explicit threat to target, in its own words, all the facilities of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, if Kurdish militants were allowed to enter Iran by regional authorities. Officials of the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq repeatedly stated at the time that they didn't want to become involved in this broader conflict and specifically emphasized the need for de-escalation, caught genuinely uncomfortably between Iran's direct threats and the reality of armed Kurdish groups operating within their own territory. Then came something genuinely significant. Reporting from the Wall Street Journal indicated the United States was actively open to supporting armed militias inside Iran specifically, and Trump himself, when asked directly about the prospect of a Kurdish offensive, responded with genuine, unambiguous enthusiasm, saying plainly, "I'd be all for it." The Washington Post separately reported that Trump had offered what it described as extensive U.S. air cover along with other backing to anti-regime Iranian Kurdish groups, specifically to help them seize portions of western Iran. In conversations with Kurdish leaders, Trump reportedly told them the Kurds needed to choose a side, either with America and Israel or with Iran, a genuinely stark framing for a population that spent decades trying to navigate exactly this kind of impossible choice between larger regional powers. Kurdish leaders themselves offered some genuinely candid, on-the-record assessments of where things stood during this early window of the war. Khalid Azizi, spokesperson for the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, told Fox News in an exclusive interview that Kurdish forces were closely watching developments but had no immediate plans to launch a full ground offensive at that specific stage, while confirming that Trump had reportedly spoken directly with Mustafa Hijri, KDPI's leader, regarding possible Kurdish involvement. Azizi's own personal history with Iranian retaliation is genuinely harrowing context here too. He was actually present and personally injured back in 2018 when Iran's IRGC launched ballistic missiles directly at KDPI's headquarters in Khoisanjak during a leadership meeting, an attack that killed at least 18 people. Despite that history, Azizi stated Kurdish resistance remained strong after decades of confrontation with Iran, while urging Western governments to focus not just on the military campaign itself, but on genuinely helping Iranian opposition movements coordinate more effectively going forward. Experts analyzing the situation at the time flagged a genuinely important operational reality Kurdish groups were grappling with. Vladimir von Wilgenberg, a researcher specializing in this exact region, argued that Kurdish groups needed real U.S. guarantees before committing to any full offensive, with one member of these opposition groups putting the core problem bluntly, stating, "We can't move if the air above us is not cleared," and calling for exactly that kind of air cover commitment before any ground offensive could realistically proceed. That's a genuinely practical, sober assessment from people who understood exactly what happened to previous Kurdish uprisings that lacked adequate external air support against a state that's repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to use ballistic missiles directly against Kurdish positions, even outside Iran's own borders. Van Wilgenberg also made an interesting observation regarding American air defense posture during this early window, arguing that U.S. systems had likely been expanded specifically to cover areas used by Iranian Kurdish parties operating within Iraqi Kurdistan, citing the relatively low casualty figures compared to the sheer number of missiles and drones Iran was firing into that specific region. That's a meaningful technical detail, suggesting active, if somewhat quiet, American protection was already being extended to these Kurdish opposition areas even before any formal large-scale offensive had actually been launched. Despite all of that early momentum and apparent American backing, though, the window for a large-scale, coordinated Kurdish offensive ultimately closed without that kind of dramatic, decisive action ever materializing. Kurdish groups remained relatively cautious and passive through the spring, citing genuine concerns about the lack of any clear, long-term American war objectives, meaning Kurdish leadership wasn't confident the U.S. was actually committed to seeing a full offensive through to a durable outcome rather than abandoning them partway through. Exactly the kind of abandonment Kurdish groups have experienced from external powers multiple times throughout their history. There were also reports of alleged leaks regarding offensive plans and arming efforts, along with real, sustained pressure from Turkey, which has its own long-standing, deep concerns about any strengthened independent Kurdish military capability anywhere in the region, given Turkey's own decades-long conflict with Kurdish separatist movements within its own borders. Together, those factors effectively closed the specific window of opportunity that had briefly seemed to be opening during those first chaotic weeks of the war. Meanwhile, Iran wasn't sitting passively during this period either. Tehran reinforced its border regions along the Kurdistan region of Iraq, pressured the Iraqi government directly to expel Kurdish opposition groups from its territory, and notably reactivated elements of what's called the Muslim Peshmerga, a pro-Iranian Kurdish militia force specifically organized to counter the independent anti-regime Kurdish groups. Iran's strikes on Kurdish opposition camps in Iraqi Kurdistan continued at a genuinely brutal pace throughout this period too. One specific attack in March, an Iranian ballistic missile barrage, killed 6 Peshmerga fighters and wounded around 30 others in Erbil province, striking military positions in the Saran district, including a divisional headquarters. The Kurdistan region's own Ministry of Peshmerga Affairs described that specific assault as a hostile and treacherous act, violating basic principles of good neighborly relations. By mid-April, Rudal reported that Iraqi Kurdistan had been struck 16 separate times since the supposed ceasefire had gone into effect, a genuinely stark illustration of how little that broader ceasefire actually meant for Kurdish opposition areas specifically, even while the main U.S.-Iran fighting had formally paused. Now here's where the story shifts into something genuinely more significant than the earlier, more cautious phase we've just covered. Beginning in early June, real, sustained clashes actually erupted between the Kurdistan Free Life Party, known as PJAK, and Iran's IRGC directly in the highlands of western Iran, specifically in Iranian Kurdistan near Marivan and the regions south of Mahabad. Through late June and into early July, these clashes genuinely intensified and spread, expanding to cover the Iran-Iraq border region itself. the Sardisht-Bane-Sakez triangle, and various urban areas, while drawing in additional Iranian Kurdish opposition groups beyond just PJAK, including KDPI joining the fighting directly. This represented Iranian Kurdish opposition's most significant sustained ground confrontation in years. Hengal, an organization that closely tracks human rights and security developments, specifically within Iranian Kurdistan, reported that these clashes had spread to multiple cities across the region, while Fox News' own coverage suggested this specific escalation could potentially lead to a renewed, larger-scale Kurdish insurgency reminiscent of the earlier historical uprisings we discussed at the start of this video. A genuinely new development also emerged during this specific window. A newly formed Kurdish militant group calling itself Son of Hope, or Zori Hiwa in Kurdish, carried out an attack on the residence of a local Kurdish Basij member in the city of Pavesh on June 29th, an attack that reportedly killed 2 Basij members and injured 2 more. Following that attack, Son of Hope formally announced its own establishment, stating its core goals were to promote political awareness, strengthen Kurdish national identity, and directly confront the policies of the Islamic Republic. That's genuinely significant, an entirely new armed group emerging specifically out of this current period of conflict, rather than one of the older, more established parties we've discussed throughout this video, suggesting the broader mobilization has been generating fresh organizational capacity beyond just the pre-existing KDPI, PAK, and PJAK structures. The fighting continued escalating into July as well. On July 1st, a genuinely significant clash occurred near Piranshar in Iranian Kurdistan, where the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan reported that 6 of its own Peshmerga fighters were killed in an IRGC ambush, while the Revolutionary Guards claimed 5 Kurdish militants had died in that same engagement. KDPI specifically named the 6 fighters killed Karo Hormuziari, Fardin Changizi, Mohammed Kaki, Abdullah Mohammadpour, Twana Osmani, and Mohammed Amin Bayezidi. A genuinely somber but important detail, naming the actual people involved rather than just citing an abstract casualty figure. Majid Glai, president of the American Kurdish Committee, offered a genuinely careful, measured assessment of what this specific escalation actually represented, telling Fox News Digital that these latest clashes shouldn't be read as a full-scale uprising, but also shouldn't be dismissed as routine border violence either. His own words were direct. What I'm hearing is, this is not business as usual. This is not like periodic clashes on the border. That's a genuinely useful, balanced framing for understanding exactly where this conflict actually stands, more serious and more sustained than the sporadic historical border incidents we discussed earlier in this video, but not yet the kind of full, decisive uprising that Kurdish groups had briefly seemed to be preparing for back in those opening weeks of the broader war, when Trump was openly discussing air cover and territorial seizure. Let's think about why this specific escalation happened when it did, in June and July specifically, rather than during the war's more chaotic opening weeks when American backing seemed most directly and enthusiastically on offer. I think the timing actually makes a lot of sense, given everything else we've covered throughout this series regarding the broader war's trajectory. The Islamabad memorandum in mid-June had brought a formal pause to the main US-Iran-Israel fighting, but as we've documented, that pause never actually extended to Iran's treatment of Kurdish opposition groups specifically. Strikes on Kurdish positions in Iraq continued throughout that supposed ceasefire period, with the broader international spotlight shifting away from the main conflict during that pause, and with Iran clearly continuing to treat Kurdish opposition as a priority security threat, regardless of any formal ceasefire status. It's genuinely plausible that Kurdish groups calculated this specific window, when Iran's broader military attention was theoretically less consumed by the main US-Israel fight, actually represented a more viable moment to escalate their own sustained resistance campaign, even without the kind of dramatic, formal American air cover commitment that had been discussed back in March. So where does this actually leave things right now, and what does the title of this video, "Thousands of Kurdish Fighters Doing Something to Iran," actually mean in practice? I think the honest, accurate answer is that Kurdish opposition groups have sustained and genuinely escalated a real, ongoing insurgency campaign against Iranian forces across the western regions of the country throughout this entire war, moving from the cautious, watchful posture of those opening weeks through to genuine, sustained ground clashes by June and July, spreading across multiple cities and drawing in new organizational capacity in the form of groups like Son of Hope. That's not the dramatic, decisive, territorial offensive that Trump had floated supporting back in March. Complete U.S. air cover and outright seizure of western Iranian territory never actually materialized at that scale. But it's also genuinely more than routine. Sporadic border friction. Real fighters have been killed on both sides. Multiple cities have seen sustained clashes, and Iran has clearly treated this Kurdish resistance as significant enough to warrant continued missile strikes, border reinforcement, and the reactivation of loyalist Kurdish militia forces specifically to counter it. That's genuinely the most accurate way to understand what thousands of Kurdish fighters have actually done to Iran throughout this war. Not toppled the regime or seized decisive new territory the way the most optimistic early framing suggested might happen, but sustained a genuine, costly, ongoing internal security challenge that Iran has had to divert real military and political resources toward managing throughout an already exhausting multi-front war, even during periods when the broader international conflict was supposedly paused. That's going to do it for this one. Let me know what you think, whether you believe this ongoing Kurdish resistance campaign eventually escalates into the kind of larger decisive uprising some of the early war reporting anticipated, or whether you think it remains constrained to this sustained but limited insurgency pattern we've documented throughout this video. Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I always read them and genuinely enjoy seeing where everybody's head is at on this. If you want to stay on top of the day-to-day developments in this conflict, go ahead and follow along on our social channels as well. And if this is the kind of deep dive coverage you want to see more of, go check out the next video. It should be popping up right about now. Appreciate you watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.